They warned her that marrying him was a death sentence, a man who lived with wolves and spoke with iron. They called him the Beast of the Montana Peaks. Elara arrived at the station with fear in her veins. Expecting a monster, she found something far more dangerous. As the massive shadow of Silas blocked out the sun, he looked at her with eyes that had seen too much blood. His first words were a warning she would never forget. He said he was only a monster to those who would hurt her, and now she must survive the winter with a man the world fears, in a land where the silence is louder than a gunshot. Stay tuned for a journey into the heart of the wild. Elara felt the cold breath of the north wind on her neck. The train station was nothing but a few rotting boards in the mud. She remembered the priest in the city telling her she was brave, but now she only felt like a lamb walking into a wolf's den. The sky was the color of a bruised plum as evening approached. She looked at the mountain peaks that seemed to touch the stars. Silas didn't offer a smile or a hand to help her onto the horse. He only watched her with a gaze that measured her strength. His saddle was worn thin from thousands of miles of travel. Every muscle in his body seemed carved from the mountain rock. She climbed up behind him and felt the heat radiating from his fur coat. The horse stepped into the dark tree line without a moment's hesitation. The forest grew so thick that the light of the moon was choked out. Elara heard the snapping of branches that sounded like bone breaking. She closed her eyes and prayed that the stories were wrong. Silas leaned back and told her to hold tight or the mountain would take her. His voice was a deep vibration that she felt in her own chest. They passed a frozen waterfall that looked like a wall of diamonds. The air grew thinner, and every breath felt like a struggle for life. He stopped the horse when they saw a pair of glowing yellow eyes. Silas didn't reach for his gun. He only stared the predator down. The wolf bowed its head and vanished into the snowy darkness. Elara realized then that the beasts of the wood respected him. They reached a clearing where a single light flickered in a window. The cabin was a masterpiece of survival built by his own hands. He opened the heavy oak door and the smell of pine pitch was strong. He pointed to a small bed in the corner covered in soft deer skins. He said, "This is your world now, and the city is a ghost of the past." He began to sharpen a long knife by the light of the dying fire. The sound of metal on stone was the only music in the room. Elara watched his hands and wondered if they would ever be gentle. He looked up and told her that fear is a choice in the high country. She realized that she was no longer a bride but a survivor in training. The wind howled against the logs like a hungry ghost. Silas sat by the door with his rifle across his knees. He told her to sleep because the real work begins at sunrise. Elara woke to the sound of wood splitting in the freezing morning air. The fire from last night had turned into a bed of glowing red embers. Silas was already outside in the snow with his sleeves rolled up. He moved with the steady grace of a predator who had found his peace. His axe hit the logs with a rhythm that echoed through the valley. Elara stepped onto the porch and felt the thin mountain air burn her lungs. Every breath she took felt like the old city life was falling away. Silas handed her a canteen of water with his scarred fingers. He didn't lead her like a captive, but walked beside her like a partner. He showed her how to read the tracks of the elk in the fresh snow. He pointed to where the sweet berries grew deep in the dark shade. He taught her that the wind wasn't a threat, but a song of the earth. They reached a high plateau where the world turned into a blue horizon. Elara looked back at the smoke rising from their distant chimney. She didn't feel the cold grip of hate or fear in her heart anymore. She only felt a vast and beautiful emptiness inside her soul. Silas told her that the mountain only breaks those who try to fight it. He began to teach her how to load the heavy brass casings into his rifle. He said a woman in the wild must be her own first line of defense. His hands were rough, but he guided hers with a strange hidden patience. Elara noticed a deep scar on his shoulder that looked like a bear claw. She realized he had paid for his peace with his own blood and bone. A shadow moved in the tree line, but Silas didn't even reach for his knife. He knew the difference between a hungry wolf and a curious deer. They spent the afternoon gathering dry wood before the next storm arrived. He told her that nature never lies, but men will kill you with a smile. Elara started to see the beauty in the harsh and jagged mountain peaks. By sunset, they were back inside the safety of the heavy log walls. Silas sat by the window watching the stars begin to claim the sky. He was the silent guardian of the world she was starting to love. Elara watched the way Silas moved through the cabin with a quiet purpose. He began to cook a simple meal of dried meat and wild mountain grains. The steam from the iron pot rose and mixed with the scent of pine. She realized that every tool in the house had a story of survival. Silas looked at her and said that the winter would be long and cold. He warned her that the snow would soon block the mountain passes completely. Elara felt a strange sense of comfort being trapped in the high country. She asked him about the scars on his hands while the fire crackled softly. He told her that the wild leaves marks on everyone who dares to stay. He spoke of a time when he had to fight a mountain lion with just a knife. Elara saw a flash of ancient pain in his eyes that he quickly hid away. She began to realize that his strength was a shield for a gentle heart. He showed her a small wooden bird he had carved during the last blizzard. It was a sign of a man who still appreciated beauty in a harsh land. The wind began to roar outside, shaking the very foundations of the logs. Silas stood up and checked the heavy iron bolts on the front door. He said that the mountain was testing their resolve tonight. He handed Elara a book with yellowed pages that he had kept for years. It was the only piece of the civilized world he had brought with him. They sat in silence by the hearth as the storm buried the world in white. Elara felt a connection to this man that she couldn't explain with words. He was her protector and her teacher in this lawless land of ice. She fell asleep listening to the steady beat of his heart against the silence, knowing that as long as Silas was there, the wolves would stay away. The morning light revealed a world transformed into a white desert. They were now truly alone on the roof of the Montana wilderness. Silas looked at her and gave a small nod of respect for her bravery. She had survived her first real test in the heart of the Great Divide. The heavy snow continued to fall, burying the cabin up to the windows. Elara found an old metal box hidden beneath the floorboards near the hearth. Inside were letters from a world that Silas had tried to burn away. She saw a photograph of a man in a clean uniform standing in a city. It was Silas before the mountains, and the scars had claimed him. He entered the room with a load of firewood and saw the box in her hands. The air in the cabin turned as cold as the ice outside his door. Silas didn't shout, but his silence was more terrifying than any scream. He took the box and threw it into the corner of the dark room. He told her that the past is a graveyard where only fools go digging. Elara realized that his danger didn't come from the wild, but from his memory. He had been a lawman who lost everything to the greed of men. That was why he had built his fortress so high above the valley floor. Later that night, the wind brought the sound of bells from the trail below. Silas reached for his rifle and checked the action with a practiced hand. He told Elara to extinguish the lantern and stay away from the glass. A group of riders was approaching through the storm looking for shelter. Silas knew their faces from a life he had left 10 years ago. They were men who carried the stench of the city and the weight of silver. The leader called out his name into the freezing darkness of the night. Elara watched from the shadows as Silas stood on the porch like a statue. He told them that there was no room for ghosts in his mountain home. The riders laughed, but their eyes were full of a murderous intent. They said the war wasn't over just because he had hidden in the clouds. Silas raised his rifle, and the clicking of the hammer was a final warning. He promised to bury them under the snow if they took one more step. The riders turned away, but their threats stayed behind in the wind. Elara understood now why he was only dangerous to those who would hurt her. He was protecting a peace that the rest of the world wanted to destroy. She walked to him and placed a hand on his trembling arm in the dark. For the first time, he didn't pull away from her gentle touch. He whispered that the shadows have finally found their way to the top. The riders disappeared into the white curtain of the blizzard, but Silas did not move. He stood like a sentinel on the porch with the snow piling at his feet. Elara could see the tension in his shoulders through the heavy fur of his coat. She wondered what kind of darkness those men represented in his former life. Silas finally stepped inside and barred the door with a heavy timber beam. He looked at Elara and said that some debts are never truly paid in full. He explained that the men were bounty hunters looking for a ghost. They believed he still carried the ledger of a corrupt empire from the city. Elara realized that her husband was a man with a target on his broad back. She didn't feel afraid of him, but she felt afraid for the peace they had built. Silas began to clean his rifle by the fire with a cold and methodical focus. He told her that tomorrow they would have to move higher up the ridge. The cabin was no longer a secret now that the wolves of the city had found it. Elara helped him pack the essential supplies into the heavy leather bags. She found herself checking the window every time the wind rattled the glass. She was no longer just a bride. She was becoming a partner in his survival. Silas looked at her and saw the fire of defiance burning in her tired eyes. He said that the mountain had finally claimed her soul for its own. They left the warmth of the hearth before the first light of dawn touched the peaks. The trail was almost invisible under the fresh layer of powdery white snow. Silas led the way, breaking the path with his massive boots for her to follow. Every step was a battle against the freezing air and the gravity of the slope. They reached a hidden cave near the summit, where the air was still and dry. Silas built a small hidden fire that didn't let off any revealing smoke. He told her that from here they could see anyone approaching for miles. Elara sat by his side, watching the valley below for any sign of the riders. She knew that the real fight was only just beginning in these high altitudes. Silas handed her a piece of dried meat and told her to keep her strength up. He promised that as long as they had the high ground, they had a chance. The shadows of the past were long, but the mountain was taller and stronger. The sky turned a terrifying shade of gray as the great winter siege began. Silas watched the horizon and knew that nature was about to become their greatest enemy. The wind screamed through the high mountain passes like a wounded beast. Elara huddled deep into her furs as the temperature dropped below what she thought was possible. Every breath felt like drinking liquid ice that froze her lungs from the inside. Silas began to stack heavy stones against the cave entrance to keep out the killing frost. He told her that the hunters wouldn't be able to climb in this weather, but they were trapped just as much as the men who were looking for them. The fire was their only lifeline in a world that had turned completely white. Silas spent the hours sharpening his blades and checking his ammunition count. He moved with a restless energy because he knew the cabin was likely being burned. Elara saw the smoke rising from the valley and felt a piece of her heart break. The small home they had built was gone, but the man who made it safe was still here. Silas looked at her and said that wood can be replaced, but a soul cannot. He promised that the mountain would hide them until the spring thaw arrived. But then they heard the sound of a signal flare echoing through the frozen air. The hunters were closer than Silas had anticipated, and they were desperate. They had found a way to survive the storm by sheltering in the old mine shafts. Elara took the rifle Silas had given her and felt the cold steel against her palm. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stepped off the train in Bitter Creek. Silas told her to watch the rear while he guarded the narrow path to the cave. The first shadow appeared through the snow, and Silas didn't hesitate to fire. The sound of the gunshot was swallowed by the roar of the mountain wind. He hit his target, and the shadow vanished into the white abyss below. Silas turned to her and said that the winter is a cruel judge of character. They spent the next 3 days in a state of constant and deadly alert. Food was running low, and the water in their canteen had turned to solid ice. Silas shared his last piece of bread with Elara and told her to keep fighting. He saw the strength in her eyes and realized he wasn't alone in this war anymore. The mountain was their fortress, and the storm was their silent ally against the city men. By the fourth morning, the wind finally died down, and a haunting silence fell over the peak. They emerged from the cave to find a world that was empty of everyone but themselves. Silas looked at the tracks in the snow and saw that the hunters had retreated for now. He whispered that they had survived the siege, but the war was far from over. The spring thaw began to melt the heavy mountain snow, revealing the secrets beneath. Silas and Elara descended from the high peaks to find the valley changed forever. They found a wounded hunter abandoned by his own men in the melting slush. Silas didn't finish him, but instead sat by the dying man to hear his final words. The man whispered that Silas wasn't a criminal, but a man who knew too much. He revealed that Silas had been framed by the very people who ran the city. The letters in the metal box were evidence of a massive land robbery by the railroad. Silas had stayed in the mountains not to hide from justice, but to protect the truth. Elara looked at the man she called husband and saw the weight of the world on him. He had been carrying the burden of an entire territory on his scarred shoulders. Silas stood up and looked toward the town of Bitter Creek with a new fire in his eyes. He told Elara that the time for hiding in the shadows was finally over. They needed to bring the evidence to a judge who couldn't be bought with silver. But the hunters had already reached the town and spread lies about the mountain man. They told the people that Silas was coming to burn the town to the ground. Elara realized that they were walking into a trap set by the most powerful men. Silas handed her a small leather pouch containing the original land deeds. He told her that if anything happened to him, she must keep riding east. She refused to leave his side, saying that the mountain had made them one. They reached the edge of town as the sun began to set, casting long bloody shadows. The sheriff was waiting for them with a dozen men and rifles aimed at the trail. Silas stepped forward without raising his weapon, showing his empty hands. He called out the names of the men who had betrayed the law and the people. The silence that followed was heavier than any blizzard they had survived. Elara felt the pouch against her side and knew the truth was their only weapon. A shot rang out from a rooftop, but Silas had already sensed the danger. He pulled Elara behind a stone trough as the street erupted in chaos. The dangerous truth was finally out, and there was no turning back now. Silas looked at her and said that today they would finish what started 10 years ago. The mountain man was no longer a myth. He was the storm coming for the corrupt. The air in Bitter Creek was thick with the smell of gunpowder and old grudges. Silas moved through the crossfire like a ghost who had returned from the grave. He kept Elara behind the safety of the heavy brick walls of the general store. She watched as the man she loved faced the demons of his past with a cold steel gaze. The leader of the hunters stepped into the middle of the street with a silver-plated revolver. He shouted that the mountain man was a relic of a world that was already dead. Silas didn't respond with words, but with the steady precision of his lever-action rifle. Every shot he fired was a message to the men who had stolen his life and his name. Elara realized that Silas was drawing all the fire toward himself, so she could escape. He whispered to her that the truth must reach the capital even if he stayed behind. She saw the blood on his fur coat, but he didn't stop moving forward against the tide. He was a shield of muscle and bone standing between her and the corrupt laws of the valley. Silas took a bullet in his shoulder, but he didn't drop his weapon or his focus. He looked back at Elara and gave her a nod that said everything their hearts knew. She knew she had to run toward the horses while he held the line at the edge of town. The sounds of the battle faded as she rode hard toward the eastern horizon. She felt the weight of the land, deeds in her pouch, and the weight of his sacrifice in her soul. Silas stood alone against the remaining men until his ammunition finally ran dry. He used his rifle like a club, refusing to let the shadows take the light he had found. The mountain man had given her his life so she could give the world his truth. Elara looked back one last time and saw him standing tall as the sun finally disappeared. He was the ultimate sacrifice for a peace that he would never get to see. Silas felt the sting of the cold lead, but his heart was focused on Elara's safety. He blocked the narrow alleyway with his massive frame as the hunters closed in. Every breath he took was a struggle against the pain blooming in his chest. He remembered the first time he saw her on the dusty station platform. She was the only beautiful thing he had seen in 10 years of mountain solitude. The lead hunter shouted for his men to flank the mountain man from the rooftops. Silas pivoted with a speed that defied his heavy injuries and fired upward. He was a warrior of the old world, fighting a war for the future of his bride. Elara looked back through the smoke and saw him fall to one knee in the dirt. She wanted to scream his name and run back to him, but his eyes told her to keep going. His sacrifice was a bridge of blood that she had to cross to save the territory. Silas smiled for the first time as he watched her horse vanish into the distance. He knew that even if he died today, his truth would live on in her hands. He gripped his empty rifle and stood up one last time to face the coming storm. The men of Bitter Creek watched in awe as the mountain man refused to stay down. He was no longer a beast to them, but a hero who was dying for their freedom. The silence that fell over the street was broken only by the sound of his heavy boots. Silas had given everything he had to the woman who brought light to his darkness. Months had passed since the snow had melted into the rivers of Montana. Elara stood at the window of a grand stone building in the capital city. She had delivered the truth to the men who still believed in the law. The land deeds had been restored, and the corrupt empire had fallen to pieces. She wore a dress of fine silk, but her heart was still in the high country. Every night she dreamt of the smell of pine smoke and the sound of his voice. The world thought the mountain man was a ghost, lost to the dirt of Bitter Creek. But Elara knew that a man like Silas didn't die as long as the peak stood tall. She returned to the valley on a day when the sun was gold against the grass. The townspeople watched her with respect as she rode toward the mountains. She climbed the trail that she had once walked with fear in her veins. The cabin was still standing like a fortress against the passing of time. She saw a figure sitting on the porch carving a small piece of cedar wood. Silas looked up, and the scars on his face were a map of his survival. He had endured the fire and the lead because he had a reason to return. Elara ran to him and felt the strength of his arms around her once again. She asked him why he had stayed in the darkness for so long. Silas looked at her with eyes that were now full of peace and light. He remembered what the world had whispered about him at the start. He told her that they were right about him being a dangerous man, but he whispered the words that would stay with her for a lifetime. He said he was only dangerous to those who would ever try to hurt her. They sat together as the stars began to claim the big Montana sky. The mountain man and his bride were finally home where the silence was kind. Their story was no longer a tragedy, but a song of the wild frontier. And the wilderness was no longer a place of fear, but a place of love. If this emotional story of the mountain man touched your heart today, then please hit the like button to show your support for their journey. Comment below what you think happens next in the Montana wilderness. Do you believe Silas and Elara are truly safe from the city shadows now? Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories from the frontier. Share this video with someone who believes in the power of a second chance. Click the bell icon so you never miss a part of our upcoming sagas. Thank you for watching and being a part of our storytelling community. We will see you in the next story.
Hi, my name is William Sunny, the owner and manager of Iron Cowboy Gardena. After watching the video, they pushed him too far. The mountain man's wrath mother, the child needed the fire. Child needed, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was how Silas carried so much pain and isolation, yet still chose to protect the people he loved instead of letting bitterness consume him. Elara came into the mountains afraid of him, but over time she saw the quiet loyalty and sacrifice hidden beneath his rough exterior. I think the story reminds us that some of the strongest people are also the ones carrying the deepest scars. Do you think Silas would have ever come down from the mountains if Elara hadn't entered his life? And which moment made you realize he was fighting for something bigger than himself? In everyday life, I think we sometimes judge people too quickly without understanding what they've survived. A little patience and compassion can completely change how we see someone. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment, like, or subscribe. I always enjoy hearing your thoughts and seeing which moments stayed with you the most.